Good evening and welcome. I'm Aaron Ramirez from the Special Collections and Museum Services Department of the Pueblo City County Library District in Pueblo, Colorado. And welcome to the final program of the week with Dr. Matthew Harris, lecturing on the Electoral College and the transition of power. This program is brought to you by a generous grant from the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History as part of the Revisiting the Founding Era grant. If you're interested in learning more about the founding era through original documents from this time, essays and lesson plans, look for a Gilder Lehrman link in the chat. But stay tuned for now because I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Matthew Harris. Dr. Harris is a professor of history and director of legal studies at Colorado State University, Pueblo. His many books include Watchmen on the Tower. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Matthew Harris. Ezra Taft Benson and the Making of the Mormon Rite, the LDS Gospel Topic Series, a scholarly engagement, Thunder from the Right, Ezra Taft Benson and Mormonism and Politics, The Mormon Church in Blacks, a documentary history, Zebulon Pike, Thomas Jefferson and the Opening of the American West, and The Founding Fathers and the Debate over Religion in Revolutionary America. He received a BA and MA in history from Brigham Young University and a Master of Philosophy and a Doctorate of Philosophy also in history from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Much of Harris's teaching and scholarship explores the intersectionality of religion and law, race and religion, civil rights, and right-wing extremism, particularly among religious groups. A prize-winning professor, he teaches classes on church and state, civil rights and constitution, the Constitution, and American religions. His classes have been broadcast on C-SPAN, and his research has been covered by a variety of media outlets, including the Religious News Service, C-SPAN, Salt Lake Tribune, Long Reads, and others. In addition, he has appeared on numerous podcasts discussing his research on religious disaffection, right-wing extremism, and religion and civil rights. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Matt Harris. How are you?
I'm doing well, Aaron. Thanks for inviting me today.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you here today. And so I will let you have the floor here.
All right. So before I put up my PowerPoint screen tonight, I'm going to lecture or talk about presidential power, about presidential transitions of power, and also the Electoral College. And I'm going to go for maybe 45 minutes or so, maybe 50, and then I would love to take questions about just anything relating to tonight's presentation. So that's the format that I plan to follow tonight.
Right. Fantastic. And just as a reminder, just if you have questions for Dr. Harris, please put them in the comment section of if you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, it'll be there, and we can Dr. Harris will kindly address those at the end of the presentation. So.
All right. Thanks, Aaron. So what I want to do is focus on two presidential elections this evening in the short time that we have, and two really of the most consequential presidential elections. And I say that with careful concern because there have been a number of consequential elections. But I've chosen tonight to talk about the election of 1800 between Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson, and also John Adams, who is not on this little picture. And then to the right, of course, our most recent election with Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. So, and I also want to talk about the Electoral College, why it was conceived and what went behind it, and what the Founding Fathers had hoped to accomplish with it. But first, before we begin, I think we need to talk about George Washington and who he was as a person and the precedent that he set as a two-term president. George Washington was the first president of the United States, of course. He lived at a place called Mount Vernon that you can see in this image to the left. It's on the beautiful Potomac River. Washington was like many Virginia slaveholders of his time. He had a large plantation. He hired dozens of overseers. He had, at his height, he had about 316 slaves.
Dr. Harris, if I could interrupt for a second, would you click on the start presentation, because we're just on the first slide of your presentation within
Okay.
PowerPoint.
Let's see here.
Yeah.
Where is the start present? Let's see. I did that.
Should be top left there. Should be good. Yep.
From the beginning. Can you see my slides now?
We have it on the. It's on George Washington, but we're still within the program, so which is fine.
Do you see the next one?
No, you'll have to scroll through one by one.
Oh, I guess I'm not sure how to do this. Scrolling through one by one. That's interesting.
Or let's see. There should be a. If at the very top, is that the start slideshow or begin slideshow? It might be the platform, but
let's see. It says, is it present online? I don't think that's it.
It should just be the regular present button.
Yeah, it just says start from the beginning, which is here. Mm-hmm. And but it doesn't let me go through each of the slides, it looks like.
If you'll just click on each slide in the left-hand view as you're speaking about it, then it'll show up in the main view, I guess, of the slide.
Okay, let's try this again. Maybe I'll keep it on. Does this help at all, like this?
Yes, perfect. Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yeah, not James Madison.
Okay, perfect.
And okay, perfect.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that, Aaron.
No problem.
All right, so we were on the George Washington slide, and Washington was a planter in Virginia at Mount Vernon. He was an average slaveholder at the time. That is, that a lot of his neighbors and folks in his community owned much larger plantations. You can see him on his horse during the American Revolution. Washington was about 6'2" tall, and he weighed about 215 pounds at his high point, which today is a big man, but certainly in the 18th century was a giant of a man. There are some medical historians who argue that he had Acromegaly's disease, which is an overactive pituitary gland that produces growth hormone, and it leads to unusually large hands and feet and certain facial features. So Washington was a gigantic man with big hands, big feet. One historian writes that he stood nearly 7.5 feet tall on his horse. And so he's an intimidating man. And Washington, though, for purposes of our presentation tonight, is not a politician. He is a soldier and a farmer. And so when he is thrust in the role of a soldier during the Revolution, this is something for which he had been aiming his entire life. There are two ways of fame in the world in the 18th century. One, of course, is through wealth, and the other is through the military. And so Washington, ironically enough, is able to check off both of those boxes. But anyway, when the war is over, Washington goes back to Mount Vernon. He is not interested in politics. Washington had just helped to defeat the largest army in the British Empire, or the largest empire in the world at the time, for that matter. And when George III, the man that he had just defeated, when he had heard that Washington would not announce himself dictator at the end of this incredible war, the king allegedly said, if he does that, he'll be the greatest man who ever lived. And the king was referring to something that a lot of people did in the 18th century, and they do it now. That is, when they come to power through the military, particularly through a military coup d'etat, they announce themselves dictator or king. And Washington didn't do that. And there's a great irony here, is that Washington gives up his power at the end of the American Revolution only to get it back again through the democratic process years later. And that's probably one of the greatest precedents that he sets for us, is that our leaders will come to power through the voice of the people. And that's something that I think ought not to be forgotten when we look at Washington's legacy. Washington was also, interestingly enough, considered by his contemporaries to be the most virtuous man. And by virtuous, they followed a term from the Greeks called virtu, which meant that you would exemplify public virtue, that you would sacrifice your own private interests for the good of your community. And that was what he did during the war. It was a great example of public virtue. And many of Washington's contemporaries, they had hoped that more Americans would exhibit the public virtue of one George Washington. Having said that, though, the founding fathers were not naive to the nature of man. They had read political philosophers like, say, David Hume, who said something interesting. He said that, quote, "It must be supposed that every man should be considered a knave." They also read another English philosopher named Thomas Hobbes, who said that every human being is dripping with blood in their inherent state of nature. They will knife you at the first chance they get. Well, the founding fathers didn't have a dire view on human nature like Hobbes and Hume, but they did have a realistic perspective. And Madison wrote in one of the great writings of his day, it's called the Federalist Papers, he said that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. It should be a bumper sticker, right? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. But Madison knew that humans were prone to corruption, and that's why when he participated in writing the Constitution, that they included a number of checks and balances, or as he called them, auxiliary precautions into the Constitution. That is, Madison wanted to restrain the baser impulses of humans when they could not restrain themselves. Just a little thought experiment for you listening tonight. I always ask my students this when I teach this to them during my Constitution class. And I ask them to do a little thought experiment with me. Pretend that we're downtown Pueblo. But really, you could choose Chicago, LA, it doesn't matter, Denver. But pretend we're downtown Pueblo, and you saw somebody, let's say 20, 30 feet in front of you, they dropped a $100 bill accidentally. They don't know that they dropped it, but you do because you saw it. And so would you return the money to them with little effort, or would you pick up the money and run the other way? And it's interesting. I asked my students, if 10 people were to see this person drop a $100 bill, how many of them would return the money and how many of them would keep it? And usually I get a range of comments. Sometimes I'll get 8 out of 10 would return the money to the rightful owner with just a little trouble. Just cross the road and say, "Excuse me, ma'am," or "Mister, you dropped your money." And sometimes I get like 4 or 3. And I ask them too, I said, does it change your opinion if it's in a rural community or maybe New York City? And they're pretty consistent across the board. And so it's a commentary about the goodness of humans. So when 8 people, this one student said, would return the money, he predicted, clearly he had a benign view of human nature. Well, anyway, Madison didn't think that men were angels, and so government was necessary. And when the founding fathers, or the framers of the Constitution, or the founding guys, as I like to say, jokingly, when they wrote the Constitution, they gave us a really interesting system that really undergirded how they felt about humans. And also democracy, defined for our purposes tonight as inclusion. And so you can see from this, this image here that how the framers had wanted our 3 branches of government to be selected. And you can see, in particular, there are 2 filters here. There's a filter with how we choose our president. That is, we don't choose them directly, we the people. We filter our voices through what's called an Electoral College. And then secondly, in 1787, the founding fathers built in a system whereon the state legislatures would choose members of the Senate. And of course, that changed in 1913, as you can see, with the passage of the 17th Amendment, which during an era historians call the Progressive Era, which was an explosion of democracy in the first couple of 3 decades of the 20th century. So, and then the most democratic branch, if we say the president's undemocratic in the sense that we have a filter, and also the Senate in the 18th century, well, the most democratic branch would have been the House of Representatives, who are elected directly by the people, and they have 2-year terms. And so if we, the people, don't like our representatives or what they're doing, certainly we can vote them out. And the least democratic branch of government, of course, would be the judiciary, who are thrice removed from we, the people. We don't vote for the Supreme Court directly, and nor do we have a role in removing them from office. Now, the Electoral College, why did they do it? And why did they not allow we, the people, to vote for them directly? Well, I want to give you maybe 3 reasons to consider tonight. One is most of the founding fathers were elitists of their day. They were property owners, and they didn't think like we think today. They didn't think that average people should be able to vote. That is, people who had property were deemed to be the ones who had the most to lose in the political process, and therefore they were the ones who were supposed to vote. So they were elitists, and they didn't trust democracy. They didn't think that, in fact, they oftentimes called the people the rabble. Or another euphemism they used was the meaner sort. I like that, the meaner sort. The rabble and the meaner sort. Governor Morris, one of the founding fathers, he's the guy that actually wrote the final, it's in his penmanship, is the final draft of the Constitution. But Governor Morris, a delegate from Pennsylvania, he said, quote, "When the pot boils, the scum will rise." And by the scum, he's talking about just average Americans. So the first one is they didn't trust democracy. They didn't trust the rabble to vote. Secondly, it was a matter of geography. That is, that the electoral delegates who would be chosen in their respective states, they were looked upon as having experience in politics. Some of them had served in the Confederation Congress. Some of them had served in the Continental Congress. And so the idea was that they would most likely know men running for the presidency from other states, whereas an average farmer from Georgia wouldn't have any idea who a presidential candidate from Pennsylvania was, because this farmer had never served in politics and therefore never got the chance to know who this presidential candidate from Pennsylvania is. So that was the presumption, that the electoral delegates had political experience and that they would, chances are they had served with presidential candidates from other states. And then third and final is something that James Madison wrote in another Federalist paper, one of the most famous of them, called Federalist Number 10. And he said that the electoral delegates will pass through the medium of a chosen body of citizens, and that's the Electoral College, where wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. So Madison, in typical Madison language, he was a little guy in contrast to Washington. He was about 5'4". They called him Little Jemmy. He was quiet. He was kind of bookish. I hate to give labels to people, but we would certainly call him a bookish nerd. He was erudite. He was incredibly learned and smart. And he argued in Federalist 10 that the people who had the most wisdom and who could best discern the interest of their country were these electoral delegates. Not the rabble, not the meaner sort, but these electoral delegates. And I might just add parenthetically before we move on today, I mean, I hope that most of us within earshot would find this nonsense, right? The electoral delegates, most of them are fine people. They're just party hacks. They're people who donate money to their parties. They are involved in various political affairs in their community. It has nothing to do with their wisdom and mostly to do with their pocketbooks and their party connections. And so really, it's never really, quite worked out the way that Madison had thought, because I don't think that the delegates in Denver know more about politics than I do. And I don't think they know more about politics than you do if you keep up. So anyway, but that's how Madison had envisioned this in the 18th century. All right, now I want to talk next about, with this background, I want to talk next about the first crisis in the country. And it occurs in 1800. And to give you a sense of the nation, Washington was elected as a Federalist. That is, that was the party that he belonged to. I call it party loosely because it doesn't really resemble the parties we have today. Parties were not in the Constitution. They were just viewed as being factions, something undesirable. But you can't get rid of factions, and so they were just necessary evils. And Washington was a member of the Federalist Party, and he was elected the first 8 years in office. And in 1796, his fellow Federalists, given who he was, it's Washington, this acclaimed military general, they wanted him to run for a third term. And Washington said no. And in hindsight, it's probably a good thing he said no, because when he declined to run again for a third term in 1796, he died 3 years later in 1799. So he would have died during his third term in office had he chosen to run. But anyway, the person who replaced him on the presidential ticket was somebody that he knew fairly well, a guy named John Adams from Massachusetts, who's the Federalist president. So we've had two people from the Federalist Party, Washington and then John Adams. And so Adams will serve from 1796 to 1800. And in the election of 1800, the one that I want to talk about for a few moments now, this is the first time in American history where we have a transfer of power from one party to the next. And that is when John Adams, the Federalist, is defeated by the Republican Thomas Jefferson, there is a transition of power that had never occurred before. I'm afraid I'm making it seem too simple and too peaceful, and it was anything but. The new nation, a lot of people in the new nation did not like Thomas Jefferson. He was the author of the famed, one of this country's most famous founding documents, and that's, of course, the Declaration of Independence. But Jefferson had said some things that really, really got him in trouble and made him nervous with his contemporaries. And he wrote a book. It's the only book he ever wrote. He wrote it in 1782. And in this book, he said, somebody asked him about religion. And he said that it, quote, neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg to think that there are 20 gods or no gods. Well, that's problematic for a Protestant Christian nation, and who they're afraid that Mr. Jefferson's not taking religion seriously. And so what happens is there's a number of critics who emerge around the election of 1800, and they start to call him the Antichrist. That if you elect Thomas Jefferson, you're in effect electing the Antichrist. They also said that he'll steal your Bibles. I chuckle at that one because every time we hear a politician, if you elect so-and-so, they'll steal your guns. I mean, which is just comical to me. Like a politician would go door to door and ask for your guns, right? Or Jefferson would go door to door and ask for your Bibles. But such is the nature of political rhetoric. They also said something for the first time in the election of 1800, that Jefferson had fathered children with one of his slaves, a woman named Sally Hemings. And when pesky reporters, there were reporters back then, when they would ask him about it, he simply would say no comment. In other words, it's none of your business. And of course, they took that as tacit agreement that he had indeed fathered these children. And Jefferson aficionados for decades, well into the 20th century, had denied his paternity on these children. It was anybody but Jefferson. And I should say that these were, they called them mulatto kids in those days. We wouldn't use that word today. But they were light-skinned kids. And they looked like Mr. Jefferson. So it wasn't until the late 20th century with the advent of DNA in which they were able to connect Jefferson's paternity with the Hemings descendants. And so it's not in dispute today at the Jefferson Monticello Foundation that he's the father of these children. But anyway, it was scandalous in 1800 to suggest that you were fathering children with your slaves. And a lot of slave planters were doing this. A lot of them were doing it. But it wasn't something that one would admit to if one wants to be elected into national politics. Well, anyway, Joanne Friedman, a Yale historian, she writes, quote, "The presidential election of 1800 was an angry, dirty, crisis-ridden contest that seemed to threaten the nation's very survival." And so what happened was, I think some context is really important. In those days, they didn't have presidential tickets like we have today. So if you voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, you got the package. You got both of them. If you voted for Donald Trump and Mike Pence, it's the package from the Republican side. But in those days, the second biggest vote getter would be the vice president. And I chuckle at that today, because if that were true today, of course, then Donald Trump would be Joe Biden's vice president. And that would be interesting. Or Hillary Clinton would have been Donald Trump's vice president. My goodness, if these things were not so important, I'd bring popcorn and watch it all unfold. Well, in those days, the second person got the second person, the greatest number of electoral delegates, became the vice president, and almost immediately the incumbent, the Federalist John Adams, was defeated, and so that left two Republicans duking it out. And this is Thomas Jefferson, and probably one of the most scandalous figures in American history, at least early American history, is a guy named Aaron Burr. And for some of you who know Zebulon Pike and Pike's Peak and that story a little bit, some of you might recall that Zebulon Pike was a Jeffersonian explorer, kind of like Lewis and Clark, although Pike didn't have the imprimatur to explore that Lewis and Clark had. That is, Jefferson didn't ask Pike directly to go explore like he did Lewis and Clark. And so Lewis and Clark explored the American Northwest, today's Dakotas and Washington and essentially the Northwest, Oregon. And then Zebulon Pike, of course, went to the Southwest, and he was asked to do his exploration by a man named James Wilkinson, the highest ranking military officer at the time. And Jefferson knew about Pike, but didn't commission him directly. Well, anyway, it was allegedly said that that Pike was on the Spanish payroll. He was spying on behalf of the Spanish, and all of this stuff, which is there's just no evidence for any of it. But what there is evidence for is that Wilkinson and Burr wanted to separate the Southwest borderlands from the United States at the time, which drew its boundary in and around the Mississippi River. And they wanted to name themselves president and vice president over this new territory that the Spanish had once owned or had currently owned. And so essentially it's an act of treason. And there's no evidence that Pike knew he was exploring on their behalf, committing an act of treason. There's just none, as tantalizing as it sounds. So Burr is scandalous for that reason, but he's also scandalous because he fights in a duel with a guy named Alexander Hamilton, by far and away one of the most intelligent of the founding fathers. And they'd been disputing each other, castigating each other, casting aspersions at them in public for a long time. They were bitter rivals in state politics in New York. And finally, they decided to conduct what they called a gentleman's duel. And that's where Mr. Hamilton lost his life, fell by a bullet from Aaron Burr's gun. Well, anyway, so Jefferson runs against Burr, who gets more electoral votes than Adams. And you can see from this chart here that there's a tie in the Electoral College. So by this point, Adams, the Federalist, is sort of out of the picture because he has lesser electoral delegates. But now you've got Jefferson and Burr who are tied. And the founding fathers, they did understand that this could happen, and they did have a provision for it. And that is the House of Representatives would be able to cast a vote and choose the president. They would be the tie-breaking vote. And so it took them 35 different vote casts. They were tied each time before on the 36th ballot, somebody had removed their ballot and the election went to Mr. Jefferson. But the nation was in crisis, and nobody knew if the Federalists would give up the reins of power. In fact, there was a prediction that they wouldn't. And I think today, up until the most recent election, we have always taken for granted that there would be a peaceful transfer of power. I remember very vividly in 2000 when Al Gore and George Bush, when that presidential election was contested, that Gore had decided to no longer contest it because he recognized that our democracy which was at stake, was more important than any one person. Well, Burr and Jefferson did not feel that way, and they were going to fight it to the very end. This is what one author says. He says, this is during the vote cast when it was tied and they just couldn't seem to break the deadlock. This author writes, rumors swept through Washington, D.C., which had just become the nation's capital in June of 1800, and the various state capitals about Federalist plots to deny Jefferson the presidency by a usurpation of power or by throwing support to Burr. Now, this is the part I want everyone to pay attention to carefully. Talk was rife about militias arming, a possible civil war, and the breakup of the Union. There were even reports that Thomas Jefferson would be assassinated. And it didn't happen. It didn't happen. There were a number of events that came together that Jefferson, for example, called off his supporters who were preparing in Virginia to march to the nation's capital with their militias, their guns in tow. John Adams had his militia members ready, and both men sort of quelled things down, recognizing that this experiment in democracy could not survive despite its young age, or even in spite of its young age, could not survive if two militias would contest this election. And so there was a peaceful transition of power, but it wasn't without pain. Just shortly, 5 years later, they passed the 12th Amendment that essentially gives us the process that we have today. They wanted to avoid this, the runner-up person. And so the 12th Amendment lets us vote for people in packages today. But anyway, it was a huge crisis and arguably one of the most momentous of our elections in American history. So much so that scholars have written a lot about it. You can see some of the books that I've talked about here. And notice how many of them call the election of 1800 a revolution. You see that with Susan Dunn and Daniel Sisson's book. Over here, Ed Larson calls it a catastrophe. But the revolution part is what made it a revolution was the peaceful transfer of power. There was so much tension between these two parties, sectional tensions above and beyond that most Americans at the time didn't think that the Federalists would give up power, but they did. And because they did, they set a precedent that had stayed with us up until this most recent election. Which leads me to the next election of 2020. You can see the electoral delegates here, or the electoral count. Just a reminder to some of our listeners today that it takes 270 electoral votes to become the president. And each state is accorded a certain amount of electoral delegates according to their size, their population, their electoral delegation. So if they have 2 senators, they can get 2 votes. And if they have 7 members of Congress, they get 7 more. That's where we get the 9 in Colorado. In California, I think it's 56. That means they have 2 senators and 54 congressmen. Well, anyway, so Mr. Biden won by a 306 to 232 margin. You can see what it looked like in 2016. And what's interesting about this last election is that Mr. Trump had been laying a groundwork for months prior to the election that mail-in ballots could not be trusted. And there was no evidence for such claims. But yet he had made that claim because he recognized, or at least he thought, that Democrats would voted by mail-in ballot at higher rates than Republicans. And so he'd been laying this groundwork of fraud for a long time. And he did something that no other president of which I'm aware did. And that is, on election night, he announced himself winner before the results were in. He had claimed that he had won. And of course, in these contested elections, when they're counting the ballots, one cannot presume to be the winner without having the election certified. And so I want to talk about the process that the Electoral College took, and perhaps why it was contested, and what really led to this riot on January 6th, which is one of the most consequential things since the American Civil War. And I don't say that lightly. This is an op-ed piece in the Washington Post. It came out yesterday by Congresswoman Liz Cheney, a very conservative congressperson from Wyoming. Her father, as many of you know, is the former Vice President Dick Cheney. And she said something really, really chilling in this op-ed piece. She's chastising Mr. Trump for perpetuating this idea that President Biden is an illegitimate president. And she said that the Justice Department and multiple federal judges have suggested there is good reason to believe that Trump's language can provoke violence again. Then she wrote, she said, no other person, American president, has ever done this. They've contested election. They've refused to recognize their successor. And it's deeply, deeply problematic if we as Americans believe in the democratic process. And I'll say more about this in just a moment, about the legality of it, and also, before I close tonight, about how to answer and deal with these kinds of questions. Well, this is the process that the Founding Fathers had outlined for us. The first one is the votes are cast on November 3rd. That's when we go to the polls. States are usually given wide latitude in terms of how they construct their ballots, how long they keep the polls open for mail-in ballots, and so forth. The only thing they can't change is the time. They can't say, we want to have our ballot or our election on November 6th. So the Constitution sets the date, but it doesn't really set the process. The next facet of the process is by December 14th, so this is the most recent election, the electoral delegates from each of the 50 states, they meet at their state capital, and they are supposed to endorse the will of the people. That is, if the majority of people in Colorado supported Democrat Joe Biden, the electoral delegates will cast their votes for Joseph R. Biden. Now, there are times in the past where sometimes delegates don't vote for the person to whom they're supposed to support. We call those faithless electors. It doesn't happen very often, and the reason it doesn't happen very often is because the people who are the electoral delegates are lifelong party faithfuls. They know they're supposed to represent their party and the will of the people. But sometimes there are contrarians for whatever reason, and they pass these faithless elector votes. Well, so that's what they do. They meet at the state capitol, they cast their votes, and then by January 6th, the votes are to be certified in the Congress by the vice president. It is a ceremonial procedure. This is not the time to throw away the ballots or they're invalid, none of that stuff. If there are problems with the ballot, it happens at the state level. And that's where Mr. Trump, of course, after he had tried to get the states to not certify in Georgia and Pennsylvania and in those swing states, Arizona, when he failed to get them to certify the vote here, this is when he put the pressure on his vice president to not certify. And if we just stop and think what that means for a moment, that one person, by not certifying, would be overturning the will of millions of people. And Mr. Pence understood legally that he did not have that right. And so he stood up to his boss, the president, the former president, and that's what got him into trouble. And that's one of the reasons why the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were looking for Pence, because they thought that he was supposed to hold up the process and not certify it, and certify the delegates that he wanted certified. And that's not how it works. It's never worked that way. So this is the process, and this is what led to the January 6th riots that you see here. The most chilling pictures hanging off the Capitol, scaling the Capitol. This one gives me just chills up my spine. thinking that somebody could walk through the Capitol with a symbol that had once sustained a treasonous government that had upheld slavery. That's really tough to see. I want to wrap this up with 2 more slides before we can take some questions. There was a book that was just published a couple of years ago by 2 Harvard political scientists, and I would commend this book to you if you have the interest and the time. It's called How Democracies Die, and the author, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zebat, they scoured European and Latin American democracies to look at what authoritarian dictators had in common. How did they come to power? And how did they sustain power? And they came up with 4 overlapping, overarching points that I think are really instructive today with our modern politics. The first one is authoritarians reject the democratic rules of the game. They seek to throw out ballots and deny people the right to the franchise. Number 2, they deny the legitimacy of their opponents, whether they're claim they're not born in the United States or whether they're not mentally fit to be the president or whatever the case may be. Third, they tolerate and even encourage violence. And this is, of course, one of the hallmarks of the fascist regime, Benito Mussolini in Italy, World War II, something that he had done often, committing acts of violence against his opponents. And then lastly, they curtail civil liberties, including the media, demonizing the media, which, as former President George Bush said recently, the media plays such an important role in our democratic society, because the media, if they're doing their job, they're holding those in positions of power accountable by allowing us to see what's going on in the corridors of Washington. So how do we preserve our democracy? I'm asked this a lot. I'm asked this a lot by people who watch the news, by Republicans, by Democrats. And I think the first thing is to talk to people who have misperceptions about the election. Respectful dialogue is critical. It's so easy for one side or the other to call names, but respectful dialogue is critical. Empathy is critical. To the best of your ability, put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Try to understand where they're coming from. And listening, we have to listen if we're going to change behavior. Next, we have to emphasize the rule of law and the importance of courts in our democracy. Over 60 cases, both at the state and federal level, have been filed over the most recent election, and no evidence of voter fraud was found. In fact, I want to emphasize something. I've read a number of these court briefs very carefully, and I was struck by something as I read these court briefs. They didn't, the Trump campaign and his lawyers who were filing these briefs, they didn't talk about fraud. They talked about election irregularities, like somebody not signing their name properly or putting their ballot in a proper envelope. Or they also talked about, they didn't think it was fair for some states to lengthen the time to accept mail-in ballots because of COVID. And the mail system was having some issues processing the ballots. But there was no emphasis on fraud. And that's because you cannot lie to courts. You can lie on TV all you want, but you cannot lie in the state and federal court. And so I thought that was really interesting. Courts care about the law. And I think it bears repeating that a number of these courts were even Trump appointees. So it's hard to claim partisanship when his own justices look at the evidence and don't find examples of fraud. Next, contact our elected representatives and tell them how we feel about voter suppression in Georgia and Arizona and elsewhere. And it's African Americans, our Black brothers and sisters, use the mail-in ballot system at higher rates than probably most people. And so when you're limiting mail-in ballots, you're limiting Black people. And as I've written, we've been down this road before with voter suppression during the 1960s with Dr. King. Next, I would recommend staying away from opinion programs. I think most people can't understand what's opinion and what's news. Now, this isn't to say that your news isn't from a liberal perspective or a conservative perspective, because that would be wrong. Certainly, there are news outlets today that have a liberal and a conservative perspective and everything in between. But there are some really, really good liberal and conservative news outlets out there that give the news as opposed to opinion programs. And I've given a few. If you're a liberal, the Washington Post is fine, and the New York Times is fine. If you're a conservative, the Wall Street Journal and the Chicago Tribune are well respected. And I think that's really, really important, because a lot of people demonize the media, not recognizing that working in the media, they play by rules of evidence. They can't just publish anything they want willy-nilly. Otherwise, they wouldn't have the reputations they do. And I know from having read the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and New York Times for years, they play by the rules of the evidence set, or the standards that have set in their profession. And then lastly, we have to critically interrogate social media sites. When our relative or our neighbor or whomever sends something to us, we have to ask ourselves, who produced it? Why did they produce it? And what evidence do they have that the allegation is, say, fraud? And, I had a person send me something recently that is a lot of it's just common sense, and that is that it was a link to somebody had snuck ballots out of the Pennsylvania precinct, one of the precincts, and dumped tens of thousands of ballots in the river. And this was of course, evidence of fraud. And I thought to myself, this doesn't even pass the smell test. Just think for a moment if that truly were to happen. One would have to smuggle them out in front of countless poll watchers, which would be nearly impossible to commit fraud on a scale of that magnitude. Secondly, if somebody dumped dozens of ballots in a river, people would know about it. They would snap pictures. They would find the ballots perhaps and grab them and put them on social media. None of this was ever found. There is simply no evidence for this. And that's what we have to do as critical thinkers. We have to ask, what is your evidence? And then we have to interrogate it. I know that Newsmax and some other news outlets were criticizing, Fox News also, were criticizing the Dominion voting machines, which is a company out of Denver, I'm told. And they were hired by some states to run the elections. And in some of these news programs were alleging that the Dominion voting machine had committed fraud by changing people's ballots from Republican to Democrat. That's a serious, serious allegation. It's a serious allegation. And now that the Dominion voting machines are suing Fox News and Newsmax, and they're suing the former president's lawyers, a woman named Sidney Powell and also Rudy Giuliani, it's amazing to me to see them backtrack. They've apologized, and you have to have evidence for the claims you make. And I think that's critical if we're to sustain our democracy. Well, let's end tonight where we began, and that is with the Constitutional Convention. In September of 1787, after 4 grueling months of assembling a constitution with multiple compromises, a woman had allegedly seen Benjamin Franklin. I say allegedly, this is like a secondhand account. But a woman had seen Benjamin Franklin, one of the senior statesmen at the convention. She saw him leave the Independence Hall, where they wrote the Constitution. And she approached him and she said, quote, "Dr. Franklin, what have you given us?" And Franklin adjusted his spectacles for a moment, must have had 20 or 30 seconds elapsed before he responded, "Ma'am, we've given you a republic if you can keep it." And I hope tonight that if we're to sustain our democracy, that we can stay informed, that we can engage in critical debate, that we can learn about the issues from the best news sources, and that we can make our voices heard when people strive to suppress our voices, our vote. So thank you, and I appreciate you listening tonight, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Harris. That was amazing. Now I'll invite everyone watching now to submit their questions live, and Dr. Harris will answer them. Anything that he's covered during the presentation, I'm sure he'd be happy to address. I don't see any questions now, so I'll defer to some questions that I got from my colleagues here at the library. Natalie, a former student, I believe, asks you to comment on the supermajority and the Electoral College. She would like to know what are your thoughts on the supermajority?
Well, the Electoral College I'm not a fan of the Electoral College. I'm sure that came across tonight. There have been over 750 attempts to amend it in our nation's history. It's by far and away the most recommended change. And both Republicans and Democrats at various times in American history have supported getting rid of it. And it hasn't served our interests very well. And now what we're left with are a series of battleground states that decide our elections. And if that's not undemocratic, I really can't explain what would be. But nonetheless, it seems to me in this very imprecise system that we have today, that the most effective way to choose our presidents is just to have one vote, one person. And we don't have to worry about this winner-take-all system that we have today. And I want to say just a quick word about that. The winner-take-all system is not in the Constitution. It's a political or a partisan gambit that occurred roughly in the 1830s with a president named Andrew Jackson. And the states had recognized that they could secure a partisan advantage if they could sweep all of the electoral delegates. So if you're in Massachusetts and the state legislature is controlled by Democrats, why not pass a law to support winner take all? Because that means you get all of the Democratic or all of the electoral delegates from that state. Why share? And sad to say that 48 of the 50 states have adopted that system. And when I say it's sad to say, you could have a simple majority at 51%, let's say, that support Democrats at 51%, and let's say that the Republicans register a 49% turnout for their candidate, but yet they don't get any of the electoral votes. The other party would get them all. And that's problematic. And there's a couple of states. I'm from Maine originally, and my home state of Maine and also Nebraska have a system in which they don't do the Electoral College or the winner-take-all system. They apportion their votes out to make it a little bit more equitable. So I'm not a fan of this. I've never been a fan of it, and I think it's profoundly undemocratic. And it's one of those relics from the Constitution that have survived amazingly to the 21st century.
Thank you. Karen was asking, and I think you've made this somewhat clear. Do we need the Electoral College? Why or why not, I guess, would be the question.
Well, I did mention in my remarks a minute ago that it's never worked according to plan. That is that the electoral delegates were supposed to be wiser than the rest of us. I just don't believe that. I don't believe that. And I don't want people to select my representatives for me. I want to select them myself. And some Americans say, well, Americans aren't informed. And I agree. But the answer is to not to cede your voice or your vote to somebody else. The answer is to get informed. How do we get people to be informed so that they can make better decisions in terms of who they vote for? And so the other thing is the geographic reason that we talked about. Certainly today in 2021, we know who the candidates are. We can go on social media, we can go on the candidate's website, we can listen to them on the radio or TV or wherever. So really, the Electoral College is obsolete in so many different ways. And there's since it's getting a new amendment passed to the Constitution is nearly impossible. We've had 27 of them in our 200 plus years of existence. There are some people who are trying to move around the Electoral College with this voter compact. And people in Colorado, I'm proud to say, we just supported the compact. And what it means is that there's a cluster of states that have entered into this compact. And if they get 270 electoral votes, if they get enough states to reach that 270 vote count, then they'll vote for whoever gets the most votes in the popular count. And so that's a way to bypass all of this silly nonsense of having these, a handful of swing states choose our election. Now, I'm not going to tell you that this isn't controversial, because it is. There would be, I'm sure, a litany of lawsuits. We've never gone down this road before, and the courts would have to litigate if such an arrangement were constitutional. But Colorado had just entered into it. We, the people, I can't remember the vote count, but we did support it. And there's not enough states yet to reach that magical 270. But if there is, that means that the people in Colorado will follow the national vote winner, the popular vote winner, and we'll cast our electoral delegates accordingly.
Interesting. So Hannah asks, are there faithless electoral laws in all 50 states? And if there is not, what happens if a state that doesn't have these laws votes against the majority?
Yeah, so voting, as I mentioned, is a state function, and there are some states that would impose fines if somebody didn't follow the popular count. And so you could be fined. Most states, it's just, you're shamed, you'll never be, an electoral delegate again. But the Supreme Court had ruled on this last year, and they had made it more difficult for people to break party ranks and to support somebody of their choosing. That's the whole point. You're supposed to represent the will of the people. And really, a faithless elector is a nice way of saying somebody's gone rogue. And it happened in 1980 when, in, I think, Washington, there was a Republican electoral delegate who didn't like Ronald Reagan, but that's who he should have supported, because Reagan won the popular vote in Washington in 1980. And so he should have cast his vote for Mr. Reagan at the State House. But instead, he supported an independent named John Anderson. Massachusetts in 1988, there was a Democrat who did not support Michael Dukakis when he should have. And we did not have, I need to double check this, I'm pretty certain this is the case, but we have not had any, we didn't have any electoral faithless electors in the last election. And I think we might have had 2 in 2016 with Hillary Clinton, but I'd have to double check on that.
Great, thank you. To see, do you have time for one more question, maybe?
Sure.
Okay. Your focus is largely in religion here in the United States. Do you see any connection with the Electoral College and religion in the early republic or going forward today? Is there any connections that you found throughout your research and career?
Well, so it's kind of 2 parts to that question. The first part would be the early part of the country's history. And certainly Americans were far more careful about their religious preferences than they are today. Not to say that religion doesn't matter today, because it does. But in 1800, I mean, if you were running and you called yourself a deist or a Catholic, or you were a Muslim, or you were an atheist, or you called yourself an infidel, it's the word they used, there's no way you would have gotten very far in politics, either at the state level or the national level. You had to be a Protestant Christian. In fact, just to underscore that point, Aaron, that the revolutionary state constitutions in the 1770s, I wrote a book about religion and the founding, and I was amazed at how many state constitutions not only made you swear on the Bible, but also to profess a belief in the triune God, God the Father, his Son, and the Holy Spirit. You had to say that in your oath. And of course, that wasn't the case in the US Constitution. They got rid of that. But Americans today still want religious people running. And it's really interesting. There's a clause in the Constitution. The founding fathers didn't deal with religion much in the Constitution for a variety of reasons, one of which dealt with the personalities of the convention. Some of the more diehard religious folks of the framers were not there. For example, Samuel Adams, very religious Protestant Christian. He was not at the Constitutional Convention, but he was a significant voice in the American Revolution. Well, anyway, so it dealt with the personalities, but it also the notion that religion was a state function. So we don't need to put it in our national constitution. But they did limit these test oaths. It says in the Constitution that you don't have to swear fealty to any sort of religious belief in order to hold public office. And we have Pew polls today that show Americans certain groups of people that they won't support in national politics, which it strikes me as odd. If you believe in the Constitution and this idea of a test oath, that it's illegal, why would it matter, right? What they believe. It seems to me their policies should matter. But what's interesting is the last several polls asking about Americans trusting certain religious groups, they've done this for years, and the bottom three every time in this order would be Mormons, Muslims, and atheists. They're always the bottom of the barrel. And of course, Mitt Romney struggled with that when he ran in 2008 and 2012. So the other thing I want to say with that question is that Republicans are far more religious than Democrats today. I think mostly Democrats, the polls show, would consider themselves spiritual, but Republicans have a religious affiliation. And in 1980, when evangelicals recognized that they could form a voting bloc and really conduct a grassroots effort to get people out to the polls, they recognized that by forming this grassroots voting bloc, they had enormous power. And so they swept Mr. Reagan into office. And they still hold a powerful influence in politics today, at least for Republican candidates. And so certainly religion does matter. It mattered at the founding and it matters today.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you joining us tonight. Is there any books in the works coming out soon, or anything that we should be looking out for? Any interesting classes coming up this next semester, in person maybe?
Yeah. Oh boy. Hopefully, right? Oh goodness. So yeah, I have a book I'm finishing now. It's on race and religion in American history. So I do look at race and civil rights and some other facets. I look at racial construction, how we determine who's Black and who's not, and how that affects people of faith. I also look at, in this book, about reconciliation, how various religious groups like evangelicals start to feel badly about how they treated Blacks during the segregation era. This fall, I'm teaching a class on American religions. So we do talk in detail about American religions and their impact in society. It's less a class on theology and more about how they've influenced American culture. And the class that I'm always really excited to teach is civil rights. Since I direct the legal studies program, I teach a civil rights class. It's part of that program. It's also a history class too. So we go into great detail about various approaches and strategies to civil rights. Certainly Dr. King's a big part, but Malcolm X and other Black Panthers. We talk about Black Lives Matter. We talk about incarceration for African-American men at disproportionate rates. So we talk about a lot of current and salient issues, voting rights issues. And it's always a great class to engage in contemporary issues.
Great. Super timely. I'm sure it'll be well attended. So thank you again. And so we'll say goodbye to everyone tonight. And thanks for tuning in this whole week for all the wonderful programs. And again, the programs this week will be archived on our Facebook and YouTube channels, the Pueblo City County Library District channels, and you can check those out. They'll be popping into your stream, into your feed, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much, Dr. Harris. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.